The phone rang. It was 6 p.m. on September 11th, 1962. Heinz Krug, a 49-year-old German rocket scientist living in Munich, answered. The voice on the other end was familiar, reassuring, a voice of power from a past life. It belonged to Otto Skorzeny, once Hitler's favorite commando, the man who had rescued Mussolini from a mountain fortress. Skorzeny was a legend, and to men like Krug, he was still a figure of authority. Krug was a worried man. For months, he had received anonymous, threatening letters. His family was terrified. The phone calls came at all hours, speaking in clipped, ominous, Hebrew-accented German. They knew where he worked, where his children went to school. They knew he was the head of a shell company in Munich, intra-commercial, funneling advanced rocketry components from Europe to Egypt. And they wanted him to stop. Skorzeny offered a solution. He told Krug he had contacts, powerful men who could make these threats disappear. He could arrange protection. All Krug had to do was meet him. Just a quick drive. They would talk, and Skorzeny would handle everything. For Krug, it was a lifeline. He was a scientist, not a spy. This world of shadows was suffocating him. Trusting Skorzeny, a celebrated war hero, felt like the only sane choice. He agreed. He told his secretary he was stepping out for a meeting and would be back shortly. He walked out of his office on the Schillerstrasse and climbed into the passenger seat of a waiting Mercedes. The car pulled smoothly into the Munich traffic and disappeared. Heinz Krug was never seen again. His disappearance was not a random act. It was the first kinetic move in a secret war, a brutal, high-stakes operation codenamed Damocles by the Israeli intelligence agency, Mossad. It was a war fought not with armies, but with letter bombs, kidnappings, and psychological terror. The targets were a handful of German scientists, veterans of the Nazi V-2 rocket program, who were now building a new generation of ballistic missiles for Israel's most formidable enemy, Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt. The fate of the Middle East was being decided in the quiet suburbs of Munich, the back alleys of Cairo, and the secret workshops of Mossad's most ruthless operatives. The operation's architect was a man who embodied the state of Israel's core dilemma, the necessity of survival versus the moral cost of the methods required to achieve it. Isser Harel, the head of Mossad, was a diminutive, unassuming man, known simply as Isser the Little, but his small stature concealed an iron will and a belief in absolute security that bordered on zealotry. Harel was the mastermind who had located Adolf Eichmann in Argentina and orchestrated his daring capture, bringing one of the Holocaust's chief architects to justice in Jerusalem. For Harel, the German scientists in Egypt were not merely engineers working for a foreign power. They were a continuation of the Nazi threat, their work an existential danger to the Jewish state. His primary skill was not spycraft, but an unwavering, almost terrifying clarity of purpose. He believed that any action, no matter how brutal, was justified if it protected Israel from annihilation. His opponent on this chessboard was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic and ambitious president of Egypt. A towering figure in the Arab world, Nasser dreamed of a pan-Arab union with Egypt at its center. He had been profoundly humiliated by the 1956 Suez Crisis, when an Israeli, British, and French coalition had seized the canal and routed his army. Though diplomatic pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union had forced the invaders to withdraw, the military defeat left a deep scar. Nasser was rearming with Soviet tanks and planes, but he craved a strategic weapon that could hold Israel's cities hostage, a tool of terror that would prevent another Suez-style humiliation. His skill was political theater and the manipulation of national pride. Rockets that could reach Tel Aviv were the ultimate symbol of Arab power and technological prowess. The key to Nasser's ambition was Dr. Wolfgang Pilz. A former member of the Nazi Party, Pilz had worked under Werner von Braun at the Peenemünde Army Research Center, developing the V-2 rocket that had rained terror on London. After the war, he worked for the French on their missile program before finding his ambitions stifled. When Nasser's recruiters came calling, offering a blank check and the chance to lead his own major rocketry project, Pilz saw a second chance at glory. He viewed his work as a purely technical challenge, divorced from politics. His singular skill was his deep, intuitive understanding of rocket propulsion and guidance systems. He was the brain trust, the man who could turn Nasser's dream into a terrifying reality. And then there was the wild card, Otto Skorzeny. Living a life of luxurious exile in Francisco Franco's Spain, the former SS Obersturmbannführer was a living specter of the Second World War. Hailed in Germany as a hero, he was hunted by Nazi hunters and intelligence agencies across the globe. He was a master of unconventional warfare, infiltration, and what the world would later call black ops. In the early 1960s, Mossad viewed him as a potential threat, a man who could organize the network of ex-Nazis, now scattered across the world, into a new danger. No one in Tel Aviv could have imagined that Harel would soon see this ultimate Nazi not as a target, but as a tool. The geopolitical chessboard of the early 1960s was a complex grid of Cold War tensions and smoldering regional conflicts. While Washington and Moscow faced off over Cuba and Berlin, the Middle East was a powder keg with a lit fuse. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War had ended in an armistice, not a peace treaty. Israel was surrounded by hostile nations sworn to its destruction. The state's existence was precarious, a daily exercise in vigilance. In Tel Aviv, the primary fear was a coordinated Arab attack that could overwhelm the fledgling Israel Defense Forces. Nasser's Egypt was the undisputed leader of the Arab bloc, its military the largest and best equipped. Intelligence flowing into the offices of Amman, Israel's military intelligence directorate, painted an alarming picture. At a secret facility designated Factory 333 near the Egyptian city of Heliopolis, a massive construction project was underway. U-2 surveillance photos, secretly provided by the CIA in a rare moment of shared interest, showed launch gantries and assembly buildings reminiscent of Peenemünde. Nasser was not just buying Soviet rockets, he was building his own. This program represented a strategic nightmare for Israel. The country was small, its population centers concentrated in a narrow coastal plain. Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem were all within easy striking distance of a ballistic missile launched from Egypt. The existing Israeli Air Force, while formidable, might not be able to intercept a salvo of missiles. The fear was palpable, discussed in hushed tones in the Knesset and in frantic meetings at the Ministry of Defense. It was the potential for a first strike that could decapitate the nation's leadership and cripple its military before a response was even possible. The psychological impact was just as severe. The idea of German scientists, men who had built weapons for Hitler, now building new weapons to be aimed at the survivors of the Holocaust, was a national trauma. The mission's genesis was a single, chilling intelligence intercept. In the spring of 1962, a Mossad listening post in Cyprus picked up a conversation between Wolfgang Pilz and an Egyptian general. They were discussing warhead specifications for the new Al-Zafir, the Victor missile. Most of the conversation was technical jargon, but then the general asked a question, and the answer stopped the hearts of the analysts in Tel Aviv. He asked about the missile's payload capacity for special munitions. Piltz, in his dry engineering tone, confirmed that the redesigned nose cone could accommodate a non-conventional payload of up to 500 kilograms. The phrase non-conventional payload was an immediate top priority red flag. It didn't just mean a bigger bomb. It meant chemical or biological agents. At the time, Israel's own top-secret nuclear program at the Dimona reactor in the Negev desert was in its early stages. Dimona was the nation's ultimate insurance policy, but it was also its greatest vulnerability. A single, well-placed Egyptian missile with a chemical warhead could contaminate the site and render Israel's ultimate deterrent useless. The threat had shifted from theoretical to imminent. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel, convened a secret emergency meeting with Yasser Harel. In the room were only a handful of the country's most senior defense officials. Ben-Gurion laid out the intelligence. The conclusion was unanimous. The Egyptian missile program could not be allowed to succeed. It had to be stopped. Ben-Gurion, his face grim, turned to Harel. The directive was simple and brutal. Stop them, by any means necessary. Harel left the meeting with a mandate for total war in the shadows. He designated the mission Operation Damocles, after the courtier in Greek legend who is forced to sit beneath a sword suspended by a single horsehair. For Harel, the Egyptian rockets were that sword, and it was his job to cut the thread. The operation unfurled as a multi-pronged assault, a masterpiece of clandestine warfare that began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Harel's first phase was information dominance. He dispatched dozens of Qassas, Mossad's elite field intelligence officers, across West Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. Their mission was to build a complete, exhaustive psychological and logistical profile of the entire German scientific contingent and their supply network. They were information predators, hunting for every scrap of data. In Stuttgart, a Katza posing as a university student spent weeks surveilling a mid-level guidance systems engineer named Reiner. The Katza documented Reiner's daily routine: the time he left for work, the cafe where he drank coffee, the newsstand where he bought his paper. But the real prize came after 2 months of patient observation. Reiner was having an affair. The Katza, using a camera with a long-range lens concealed in a briefcase, captured photographic evidence of Reiner's trysts with a younger woman. This was not mere gossip. It was leverage. A man with a secret is a man who can be controlled. In Zurich, another team focused on the financial and logistical pipeline. They identified a key company, Intra-Commercial, run by Heinz Krug. On the surface, it was a legitimate import-export business dealing in machine parts. But Mossad analysts, cross-referencing shipping manifests with a list of proscribed missile components, discovered its true purpose. Intra-Commercial was the primary purchasing agent for Factory 333, acquiring gyroscopes, specialized alloys, and telemetry equipment from unsuspecting manufacturers across Europe and shipping them to Alexandria disguised as agricultural machinery. The team mapped the entire network, from the factory that made the ball bearings to the shipping agent who falsified the customs documents. With this map of vulnerabilities established, Phase 2 began, a campaign of psychological terror. The first letters arrived in the scientists' home mailboxes in Germany. They were typed on plain paper, with no return address, postmarked from different European cities. The message was always the same. We know what you are building in Egypt. You are helping those who wish to complete Hitler's work. Go home. This is your only warning. For some, the warning was enough. A handful of technicians and their families packed their bags and quietly broke their contracts with the Egyptians. But the core group, led by the defiant Wolfgang Pilz, refused to be intimidated. They reported the threats to their Egyptian handlers, who responded by increasing security around their homes and at Factory 333. The intimidation had failed to decapitate the program. Harel knew he had to escalate. The decision was made in a tense meeting in a Tel Aviv safe house. The time for warnings was over. The time for violence had begun. The target chosen for this escalation was not one of the rocket scientists, but another Nazi living under Arab protection. Alois Brunner, a high-ranking SS officer and one of Eichmann's key deputies, who was living in Damascus and advising the Syrian government. Mossad's message needed to be unambiguous. A team from the Mossad unit, Mossad's division for special operations, the precursor to the Kidon unit, assembled a device in a Paris workshop. It was a parcel bomb, a simple but lethal mechanism. A small amount of plastic explosive was packed into a hollowed-out book and rigged to a chemical detonator that would be triggered when the package was opened. The package was mailed to Brunner's address in Damascus. It arrived. It was opened. The resulting explosion ripped through his office, killing 2 of his aides. Brunner survived, but lost an eye and several fingers. The message was delivered, not just to Damascus, but to every ex-Nazi collaborator in the Middle East. We can reach you. The scientists in Egypt were next. It was at this point that Harel made the most audacious decision of his career. To effectively target the hardened German community in Egypt, he needed an insider. To get to the Nazis, he needed a bigger Nazi. He decided to recruit Otto Skorzeny. The initial contact was made by a Katza in Spain, who approached Skorzeny through a mutual acquaintance. The meeting took place in a Madrid hotel bar. The Mossad agent, without revealing his affiliation, told Skorzeny that a group of influential Jewish businessmen were willing to pay handsomely for his help in persuading the German scientists to leave Egypt. Skorzeny was intrigued but skeptical. He demanded to meet the man in charge. Harel agreed. The clandestine summit between the head of Mossad and Hitler's favorite commando is one of the most surreal moments in the history of espionage. They met in a secret location. Harel, speaking through an interpreter, laid out the deal. Mossad would use its influence to have Skorzeny's name removed from the lists of wanted Nazi war criminals. The world-famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal would be persuaded to drop his case. In exchange, Skorzeny would work for Mossad. He would provide intelligence and, when necessary, take direct action. Skorzeny, a pragmatist and a narcissist who craved action, accepted. His first assignment was to deal with Heinz Krug, the man running the logistical hub in Munich. Skorzeny was the perfect weapon. Krug knew him by reputation and trusted him implicitly as a fellow German patriot. This led directly to the phone call on September 11th. We return to that evening, but now with the full, chilling context. Skorzeny was the trusted voice on the phone. He lured Krug to a prearranged location, a Mossad safe house on the outskirts of Munich. Waiting inside was a Mossad team led by the legendary operative Rafi Eitan. They interrogated Krug for hours, extracting every detail about the intra-commercial network, the shipping routes, the names of suppliers, and the progress at Factory 333. Once they had everything, Krug was no longer an asset. He was a liability. The team drove him and Skorzeny to a forest north of the city. There, by the side of a deserted road, a Mossad agent shot Heinz Krug in the back of the head. Under Skorzeny's professional guidance, they disposed of the body. They buried him in a pre-dug pit, doused the body with acid to prevent identification, and covered the grave. His car was driven hundreds of kilometers away and abandoned to throw police off the scent. The message to the remaining scientists was now terrifyingly clear. Mossad would not just threaten them, it would make them disappear off the face of the earth. The technology of Operation Damocles was a character in its own right. A collection of bespoke tools designed to solve specific, deadly problems. The letter bombs were the operation's signature weapon, and they evolved rapidly. The initial devices, like the one sent to Alois Brunner, were relatively simple. But as Egyptian and German security services learned to screen for them, Mossad's technicians were forced to innovate. They moved from standard parcel bombs to more sophisticated designs. One popular method involved hollowing out thick academic books, volumes on rocketry or physics, chosen to appeal to the target's interests. A cavity would be carved into the pages, into which a precisely measured charge of Semtex or RDX plastic explosive was packed. The detonator was the key innovation. Instead of a simple pressure release switch, which could be easily detected, they developed a chemical fuse. A small sealed glass ampule containing two reactive chemicals, separated by a thin membrane, was placed in the book's spine. Opening the book would bend the spine just enough to break the ampule, allowing the chemicals to mix. The resulting exothermic reaction would produce a flash of heat intense enough to detonate the main charge. The delivery was another layer of tradecraft. To avoid creating a traceable pattern, the packages were mailed from different cities across Europe, Paris, Rome, Zurich, Brussels, by a network of Sayanim, volunteer Jewish diaspora helpers who performed low-risk tasks for Mossad. Each package was a calculated risk, a deadly payload sent through the public postal system. In Egypt, the challenge was communication. Wolfgang Lotz, the Mossad Katza known as the Champagne Spy, had successfully integrated himself into Cairo's high society. Posing as a wealthy German horse breeder and former Wehrmacht officer, he hosted lavish parties, befriended Egyptian generals, and gained the trust of the German scientific community. His home was a primary node for gathering human intelligence. But getting that information back to Tel Aviv was a constant, nerve-wracking challenge. His primary communication tool was a marvel of covert technology, a shortwave radio transmitter concealed within the base of a bathroom scale. To transmit, Lotz would have to lock himself in the bathroom, often during one of his own parties, and attach the antenna, a thin wire he would unspool and hang out the window. He transmitted in high-speed Morse code bursts, lasting no more than a few seconds, using one-time pad encryption keys printed on flammable paper that he would burn immediately after each broadcast. The transmission windows were short and irregular, calculated by analysts in Tel Aviv to coincide with specific solar flare activity and atmospheric conditions that would bounce the signal effectively, while making it difficult for Egyptian direction-finding teams to get a lock on his position. Every transmission was a gamble against discovery by the Mukhabarat, Nasser's feared secret police. The Egyptians were not naive. They knew they were being watched. The Mukhabarat employed sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques, including random sweeps for electronic bugs and physical surveillance of all foreign nationals connected to the rocket program. For Lotz, this meant that radio transmissions were reserved for only the most urgent intelligence. For less critical information, he relied on the classic dead drop. He would conceal a roll of microfilm, containing photographs of documents or blueprints he had acquired, inside a seemingly innocuous object like a tube of toothpaste or a hollowed-out fountain pen. He would then deposit the object at a pre-arranged dead drop site, a specific loose brick in a wall at the Khan el-Khalili market, or tucked beneath a particular bench in a Cairo park. Hours or days later, a different Mossad operative, perhaps a flight attendant on an international route or a diplomat, would retrieve the package. The tension was constant. Lots described near misses where Mukhabarat agents would search the area moments after he had made a drop, or the feeling of being followed through the crowded Cairo streets, forcing him to take elaborate, meandering routes to ensure he wasn't leading them to a contact. Just as the operation was reaching peak intensity, it was derailed by two unforeseen disasters. The first was a catastrophic failure of tradecraft in Switzerland, born of arrogance and poor planning. A disgruntled Austrian scientist named Otto Jochlik, who had a personal vendetta against Wolfgang Pilz's team, had approached the Israeli embassy in Vienna offering information. He was passed to Mossad. A team of European-based Katzes, led by an agent named Yosef Ben Gal, decided to use Jochlik to apply direct pressure on the family of Dr. Paul Gurke, a key guidance expert. The plan was amateurish. They decided to corner Gurke's daughter, Heidi, in the town of Lorach and threaten her. On March 2, 1963, Ben Gal and Jochlik drove to her home. Unbeknownst to them, Swiss authorities, alerted by the Germans who were already investigating the threats, had placed Heidi Gurke under surveillance. As Ben Gal and Jochlik approached her, Swiss police moved in to arrest them. A frantic car chase ensued through the quiet Swiss streets, ending when the agent's car was cornered. The arrest was a bombshell. Israeli agents and neo-Nazi associate arrested in Switzerland after car chase, screamed the headlines across Europe. The story was a public relations nightmare, linking Israel to a neo-Nazi accomplice in a clumsy intimidation plot. The Swiss government lodged a formal protest. The West German government, already uneasy about its citizens' work in Egypt, was now publicly furious with Israel's methods. Israel issued a formal but unbelievable denial, claiming the men were private citizens acting on their own. The scandal exposed a critical part of Operation Damocles to the world and severely damaged Israel's international standing. The Swiss disaster was the final straw for Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. He was a statesman, deeply concerned with Israel's legitimacy on the world stage. He saw Harel's methods, the letter bombs, the kidnapping, the Swiss fiasco, as gangster tactics that tarnished the nation's image. He summoned Yasser Harel to his office for a confrontation that has become legendary in the annals of Israeli history. It was a clash of two titans, two fundamentally different visions of the state. Ben-Gurion, the nation builder, argued that Israel had to operate as a lawful country, not a clandestine gang. He accused Harel of endangering Israel's crucial relationship with West Germany and making the Jewish state look like a pariah. Harel, the spy master, retorted that his sole duty was to prevent a second Holocaust. He argued that the rocket program was an existential threat and that diplomatic niceties were a luxury they could not afford in a fight for survival. "You have brought shame upon the state of Israel," Ben-Gurion reportedly roared. Harel, feeling his authority and methods completely repudiated by the man who had given him the mission, stood up and resigned on the spot. The abrupt departure of its legendary chief threw Mossad into chaos. The organization was Harel's creation, run on his personal authority. His exit left a power vacuum and brought Operation Damocles to a screeching halt. Ben-Gurion appointed Meir Amit, a former general and head of military intelligence, as the new Mossad chief. Amit had a different philosophy. He favored surgical strikes and political maneuvering over Harel's campaign of terror. The entire strategy had to be reevaluated, but the wheels Harel had set in motion were still turning. A final, deadly wave of mail was already on its way. On the morning of November 27, 1962, The daily mail delivery arrived at the main gate of the heavily guarded Factory 333 compound. After a cursory inspection, a clerk carried the mail bags to the administration building. There, Hannelore Venda, Dr. Pilz's loyal 35-year-old secretary, began sorting the mail. Sifting through letters and journals, her eyes fell upon a thick, book-shaped package from Hamburg. The sender was a reputable German academic publisher, so she reasonably assumed it was a research text Pilz was expecting. She carried it into her boss's office and placed it in the center of his large desk. Dr. Pilz himself was unavailable, deep in a technical review meeting that was running longer than scheduled. Down the hall, he and several Egyptian officers were engaged in a heated debate over a persistent fuel pump vibration in the Al-Qahir missile. A little after 11, Hannelore returned to the office to file some papers and saw the book still sitting on the desk, untouched. Knowing Dr. Pilz was always eager for new material, she decided to do something helpful. She would unwrap it for him so it would be ready the moment he returned. She picked up the package, tore away the brown paper, and opened the front cover. In that instant, the simple act bent the book's spine, breaking a fragile glass ampule hidden within. Two chemicals mixed, producing a silent flash of intense heat that detonated the C4 explosive packed into the book's core. The device was designed for precision, not demolition, directing its force upwards in a focused cone. The desk splintered, the office windows shattered, and Hannelore Venda, leaning directly over the book, took the full force of the blast to her face. On the very same day, another mail bomb, sent to the rocket factory's general mailroom, detonates, killing 5 Egyptian workers instantly. The psychological shockwave from these attacks was far more powerful than the explosions themselves. This was no longer a distant threat. It was bloody, immediate, and personal. The German scientists were suddenly confronted with the visceral reality of their work. This wasn't a clean, technical endeavor anymore. Their offices were now battlefields. Their secretaries were being maimed. Local workers were being killed. The wives of the scientists, who had already been living in a state of high anxiety, panicked. They delivered an ultimatum to their husbands: us or the rockets. The dream of rocketry glory in the Egyptian sun had turned into a waking nightmare. The immediate fallout was decisive. The bombing of Hannelore Venda and the deaths of the Egyptian workers created a firestorm of negative publicity. Gruesome photos of Venda's injuries were leaked to the European press. The German public, which had been largely indifferent, was now horrified. The story was no longer about national ambitions. It was about German women being blinded and innocent workers being killed by terrorist bombs. The government of Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, which had been trying to handle the situation discreetly, was now under immense public and political pressure to act. The Bundestag swiftly passed a new law, making it a criminal offense for any German citizen to work on foreign weapons programs. The government offered significant financial incentives and legal amnesty for any scientist who would break their contract with Egypt and return home immediately. The dam had broken. One by one, then in a flood, the scientists and their families packed their belongings. Their Egyptian handlers tried to persuade them to stay, offering more money and enhanced security. But it was useless. The fear was too great. Even Wolfgang Pilz, the program's defiant leader, finally gave up. He had survived several assassination attempts himself, including one where his car was ambushed, and the attack on his secretary was the final, horrifying straw. He quietly left Egypt. Deprived of its German brain trust, the Egyptian rocket program collapsed. The complex technical challenges of guidance, propulsion, and fuel stability were too great for the Egyptian engineers to solve on their own. Nasser ordered the Al-Zafir and Al-Kahir missiles to be paraded through the streets of Cairo as a show of strength, but it was pure propaganda. The missiles were little more than hollow shells, incapable of hitting a target with any accuracy. They never became the strategic weapon Nasser had craved. Operation Damocles, for all its brutality, controversy, and internal chaos, had succeeded. The sword hanging over Israel had been removed. The full story, however, contained one final, stunning revelation that would not become public for decades. The legacy of Operation Damocles was not simply the termination of a rocket program, but the story of its most unlikely asset, Skorzeny. Years after the operation, through the slow declassification of intelligence files and the work of investigative journalists, the true nature of his deal with Mossad emerged. He did not just help them kidnap and execute Heinz Krug. Skorzeny, using his impeccable credentials as a Nazi war hero, became one of Mossad's most valuable agents in the Arab world. He traveled to Egypt and met with the German scientists, pretending to offer them security while secretly mapping their entire command structure for his handlers in Tel Aviv. He used his vast network of ex-SS contacts to identify other Nazi collaborators working for Arab intelligence services. But his most critical contribution, the true reason Harel was willing to make a deal with the devil, was revealed in a single, top-secret memo. In 1963, Skorzeny learned from his contacts in Cairo that the rocket program was a cover for something far more sinister. A small, elite group of Egyptian physicists, with help from a separate team of German scientists, were secretly working on a project to develop a radiological dirty bomb. The plan was to use the Al-Kahir missile not to deliver a conventional explosive, but to disperse radioactive cobalt-60 over Tel Aviv. Skorzeny's warning reached Tel Aviv just as the new Mossad chief, Meir Amit, was shifting strategy away from assassinations and towards diplomacy. This new intelligence changed everything. The threat was 1,000 times worse than they had imagined. It recontextualized the entire operation. Harel's brutal campaign, which had seemed like overkill to Ben-Gurion, was now understood to have been a desperate, if unwitting, race against a radiological catastrophe. The ultimate irony of Operation Damocles is that the man who saved Mussolini for Hitler, a man who represented the very ideology that sought to annihilate the Jewish people, performed a pivotal act that secured the safety of the State of Israel. His motives were entirely selfish, a pardon for his war crimes and a peaceful retirement. But his actions had unforeseen and history-altering consequences. The story ends not with a clean victory, but in the deep moral ambiguity of espionage, a world where survival demands unthinkable alliances, and the line between hero and monster is drawn not in ink, but in blood.